Hi everyone, my name is Heidi Crockett. This is Examining Your Pleasure Trap Dysregulated Nervous System Q&A. I give lectures at True North. I also see clients privately. I have some classes available online at my website if you like this class. I used to call my consults Yes Brain consults. I just call them Heidi consults now. They're just about what you can do to improve your emotional intelligence and how you can regulate your nervous system. Today's talk is what is a healthy nervous system and what causes a nervous system to become dysregulated. And then I talk about what you can do to heal your nervous system. So I have made this talk specifically because someone requested it. I gave the talk at True North, and here it is available for you. So the pleasure trap is part of a book that Dr. Alan Goldhammer and Dr. Doug Lisle wrote about. They talk about the motivational triad, pursuing pleasure, avoiding pain, and conserving energy, and that abnormal lifts in the dopamine circuits result in a dysregulated nervous system, and that an animal can actually kill itself in certain circumstances through this mechanism of seeking pleasure. So I just give a basic overview of the nervous system. If you look here at this chart, it's really complicated. There's the central and the peripheral, and there's sensory and motor nerves, and then there's autonomic and somatic. So this bottom left, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, are really what we're going to be talking about. And then this new part called the social engagement system, which has to do with the vagus nerve. Is an added piece that most people unfortunately are not aware of. So I'm going to give you some new information about the nervous system that can help you understand what you can do to heal yourself better. I think that's the main reason why it's called polyvagal theory. It's about the social engagement system. Then there's the sympathetic and the parasympathetic and what happens in the stress response. And only mammals have this myelinated ventral vagus nerve. Reptiles have the dorsal unmyelinated vagal nerve, which relates to the freeze, collapse, submit response. And I have a cute little chipmunk sequence of events to explain the social engagement system later on. So if some of these science terms seem like too much, just fast forward to the chipmunk video. So primitive urges were part of that pleasure trap outlined, and I call it like the judging brain, the part of our brain that sees everything like black-white thinking. There's a more primitive part of our brain. It's like the limbic brain, and then the brain stem. And then there's the newest part of our brain. It's known as the neocortex, or I call this part the prefrontal cortex specifically. And there are more furrows here, so there are more neurons here than any other part of the brain. And I talk about how this is like the pilot of your life because it monitors input from the cortex, from the limbic, from the brain stem, from the body, and from your social environment. So you need your whole brain, you need all your nervous system, but you're going to learn today that this part of your brain, the medial prefrontal cortex, is really important, and it can help us overcome these primitive urges and this pleasure trap that we can get caught in. And the other new information I'm going to give you in my talk today is that we used to think of the nervous system as like you get stressed out, you want to fight or flight, and then if it gets really bad, that's the sympathetic. If it gets really bad, then you completely collapse and you want to die. That's the faint, fight, flight, freeze, faint. And it's kind of like this on-off sympathetic, parasympathetic. But the truth is that we actually have a new part, a third part, called the social engagement system, which has to do with the vagus nerve. It happens in milliseconds after stimuli is received. We either will look around at our environment, we'll code it in our brain that the noise we heard is safe, and because the vagus nerve gives us input that goes down and helps with our heart and our breathing, we can decide to switch our system back in the parasympathetic or whether or not to go in high gear, and that noise meant go into the sympathetic. And once you have that sympathetic stress response where you want to fight or flee comes in, it takes 10 to 20 minutes at the bare minimum to get your nervous system calmed back down, back in that rest and digest parasympathetic. So the social engagement system I'm going to be talking about is crucial Once you learn how you can engage it more and use it more in those split seconds in the beginning of a stressful situation, you can, once you understand this, you can actually use your breathing, for example, to engage the vagus nerve and calm down and get yourself more in the parasympathetic state and save yourself from secreting all that extra cortisol, which is from the adrenal glands, and it goes throughout your whole body. Cortisol is a stress hormone, and it shrinks your brain, and it does all these bad things. So we definitely want to learn how to better regulate our nervous system so we can live a longer life. So that's just a basic overview. And so this is straight from the book, What is the Pleasure Trap? We conserve our energy and pursue the pleasures of high-fat, addictive food, and then other things kind of feed the same dopamine circuit like drugs or sexual compulsivity. And then finally, it reads, when we move away from blaming ourselves, that's limbic brain thinking, the solution is to focus on reclaiming our power, which is thinking about thinking and the prefrontal cortex. So I'm just going to bring in my language around this pleasure trap. So what we have is the motivational triad. And I just talk about primitive drives, like I said, being the limbic brain. I'm going to show a picture of that here in a minute. So the limbic brain is always thinking, am I safe? Do people want me? Am I safe? Do people want me? And I used to do a lot of dementia education in Florida. And when people start to have dementia, this is what happens. They slowly kind of get a little more in their limbic brain, and the way they're perceiving reality is more about safety, and the emotions live there. Sometimes this is referred to as the emotional brain. And whereas we have your medial prefrontal cortex, your ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, these are generalizations. Your limbic regions and your prefrontal cortex is more complex than this, but just letting you know, I try and simplify things to keep it simple. So basically, you have the ability to think about thinking. This is the most recent part of your brain, and it's called executive function. And there are 9 functions of the prefrontal cortex I'm going to talk about in a minute, which are all things like basically about inhibition. So fear modulation is one of those 9 functions, which is the ability to unlearn a fear. So a lot of these higher brain functions are about inhibiting behavior, stopping the pleasure trap, and being able to think about thinking and have response flexibility and make a new choice. So your prefrontal cortex, it focuses attention, it delays response, and it allocates resources. So again, it's like crucial. And I said earlier that it monitors and modifies input from your cortex, your limbic brain, your brain stem, your whole body, and then all your surrounding environment. So all that information is just kind of being taken in. And then this pilot, the pilot of your life, I'm going to come back to this, the pilot of your life is in charge of all those 5 functions. And so I just take a little side step because this pilot is so important. And I'm like, what can you do to grow this part of your brain? And we have 2 things, according to the research, and I said it earlier: have securely attached relationships and meditate regularly. These grow 8 of the 9 functions of the prefrontal cortex. The only one we can't measure is intuition. Intuition is you have neural networks in your intestines and in your heart that go up through the insula to your prefrontal cortex. So intuition is actually a higher function, but we can't measure it so far. So when I say these, meditating and having securely attached grows your prefrontal cortex. The meditation, specifically when I say that, I'm talking about the 3 pillars of mind training, which is focused attention, open awareness, and an intention of kindness. So this is based on a lot of research on neuroscience. You may have your own mindful awareness practice map that works for you. You may call it something different, a meditation practice, a prayer practice, but it is called like brain flossing or brain fitness. I like to come from this angle so that wherever you're coming from, whether it's a science or a spiritual or religious perspective, you can understand that it's really important in the same way that we strengthen our muscles, so our bones and our muscles can stay strong. We need to strengthen our brain muscle so this thinking about thinking part of our brain can stay strong. And when you have a practice, what you want is you want to be able to make sure that your practice has all 3. And when you meditate, it strengthens, see these 9 functions of the prefrontal cortex, all these grow. And you can see that response flexibility. So if you meditate, let's say 5 minutes a day, and you're being aware of your body breathing itself, that's focused attention. So if you do that for a while, and then later on in the day something happens, you may be able to observe that something happening with a little bit more response flexibility, where you pause between impulse and action because of the meditation you've been doing earlier in the day. So it's just mind training. It strengthens this part of your brain that can help you inhibit and make better choices. So this is what the science says that meditation does. So here's just some proof why it's so important. It grows the integrative fibers of the hippocampus, the corpus callosum, and the medial prefrontal cortex. It improves cardiac function, so it lowers blood pressure, it lowers cholesterol. It increases the production of telomerase, so it's anti-aging. It improves inflammation. In other words, it decreases inflammation, and it improves immune function. So these are all reasons why I encourage that people, maybe just 1 minute a day if they can, do meditation. And I would recommend that you do 1 minute a day to start out with, and that you end that minute with kindness. And some recommendations for apps. There's an app called Headspace, which has programs that can motivate people. And I like something called unwindinganxiety.com. It's from Judson Brewer's research from the book, The Craving Mind. So it's based on a lot of his research. And then always I like the book, The Mindful Way Through Depression, based on mindfulness-based stress reduction and all this research. So those are just some resources. There are tons more out there. I could just give a whole lecture on it. The key is just try and incorporate that. Do that 1 minute right when you wake up in the morning. Grow that part of your brain that's going to help you with those primitive drives and that pleasure trap urge. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about why, when you do meditation, what does it help with? If you can look here at this picture, you've got the brainstem, the limbic brain, and the medial prefrontal cortex. And when you have vertical integration, you can get input come in, like the slamming of a door or a fire alarm or someone screaming at you, and you can control the nervous system a little better because you have access to more information. That's the idea, but that the meditation grows the ability to have insight on why you're getting suddenly really stressed out at the sound of a slamming door. Oh yeah, when I was a kid, doors used to slam and this used to happen. Empathy, where you make a mind map of other people, so you can have empathy. Oh, the person who slammed the door is having a bad day. It really has nothing to do with me. So that's empathy. So those are all different functions of the prefrontal cortex, higher functions. So you have those higher functions, you have access to them, and it makes you be able to differentiate from that stimuli that causes a person normally to stress out. And you can take a deep breath in and a long exhale with pursed lips on the exhale. So you make a really long out breath, and just using your breath as a tool, that puts you in the parasympathetic state, and that helps calm you down. So you can mentally do things to try and calm yourself down. It's called self-soothing. You can also use your breath to help you calm down. So there are lots of ways we can learn how to better regulate our nervous system. And more on that is on my relational neuroscience class on my website, HeidiCrockett.com. So the pleasure trap, like I said, when we get a dysregulated nervous system, it's harder to regulate our emotions. And the more we kind of judge, blame, we're in the limbic brain, black-white thinking, in the emotions, it's harder for us to have that response flexibility. And in the same way that society doesn't want us to slow down and look at our food choices, I always say food products as opposed to food. A food is like a pineapple, and a food product is the pineapple strips, like sugar added and then baked or whatever. So we want to look at our food choices, our food products. In the same way, society doesn't want us to slow down and heal our nervous system. So there are things we can do to heal our nervous system. I have a video on YouTube, 5-minute video on memory reconciliation. I recommend that you look on that. I'm going to talk on it during this talk briefly. But I would encourage you to begin to do things so that you can fulfill your brain's potential for excellent executive function. So the truth is that we can think about thinking, we can have response flexibility, we can be aware of a lot more things in our moment-to-moment experience of reality than what we currently are, especially if we're really geeked up and going really, really fast. It's hard to really pay attention to what's going on in our body, what's going on around us, if we're just plowing through life. So there's a specific skill set we can cultivate the more integrated we become. And there are things you can do to increase your integration, is my point. And by increasing your integration, you have better control over the pleasure trap. Finally, when you blame, it's part of the limbic brain, and then we think about thinking, we can have more flexibility and curiosity. So my main tip, if you want to come from your prefrontal cortex, is that you come from a place of curiosity. And if you notice yourself judging or blaming, just know you're more in the limbic brain and try and shift to a place of like friendly curiosity. Like, why is that going on? And that actually is like, it helps shift your nervous system. Like you think of shifting gears in a car. Just using that friendly curiosity can be a tool. So this is a graph about the pleasure trap. The idea is that when we're born, we have kind of normal taste buds, and then we get all these high-fat foods, and our taste buds adapt. And then we go back to this third phase where we're actually eating really high-fat diet, a diet that's not normal for us, but our taste buds have adapted. And then when we go down to this phase 4 and we eat just 600 and lower on a caloric density scale. And if you're listening to this video and you don't know what I'm talking about, YouTube caloric density. And the goal is that you eat at least 90% of your food at a 600 or lower. If you're doing that, you're doing pretty good. That you're doing the basics in terms of how to live a long, healthy life and heal whatever kind of health condition you might have. So a person's eating that way in phase 4, but food appears to have very little flavor because you're used to this high salt, high fat diet. And then you reach a final phase where everything is restored and the food is really flavorful and you love it. You don't need to have all the extra salt and fat in your diet, and actually you're really healthy. So that's the idea. And the interesting thing is this is kind of similar to the nervous system. So this is why I brought this up. This is called a trauma resiliency model. You can look it up. Is that right? Community resiliency model. And you can get information on this for free on the internet. There's just this idea of this nervous system. I call it your window of tolerance, or resilient zone is what they call it in this model, where it's just about expansion and contraction. Some people might have heard of the concepts of yin and yang. I talk about differentiation and linkage and neurobiology. All of these terms overlap. But the idea is like with stress, for example, right now, if I didn't have some tension in my spine, I wouldn't be able to stand up. So we need some stress in our life, but we don't want too much so that we become manic or hyper-aroused. We don't want too little so we become lethargic. So the idea is that we have a charge, we release it. We have a charge, we release it. And we stay in our resilient zone. We don't freak out, go into hyperarousal, and then have to eat an entire bag of potato chips. That's the ideal. And I have this slide up because if you look at those middle emotions, when we talk about arousal, that's a clinician term, you can think of emotional intensity instead. So this is kind of like from low to high on the intensity scale. And there in the middle is your window of tolerance. You can be stimulated, you can be motivated, you can be challenged, you can be engaged, but you're in your window of tolerance. And the reason I put this slide in is just so you understand those emotions. And then if you get too much, then you're out of your window of tolerance or your resilient zone. And if you're too little, you're kind of numb and you're not really feeling the passion of life. So here's that same idea. Down at the bottom is depression, hypoarousal, or numbness. Or up here, you get amped up, you're hypervigilant, you're manic, you have anxiety or rage. So you're way high. And they call that the resilient zone or your window of tolerance. And I use a river of brain integration model and these riverbanks of rigidity and chaos. So I'm going to flip this chart in a minute and have a river. But it's the same model. It's just this idea that we have an optimal arousal zone and we want to stay in that. And so for you, let's say you're thinking about eating. You want to make sure that the stress in your life is under control as much as possible, because when you get really stressed out, that's when your window of tolerance, when you start to hit this edge, this hard edge, where you're going to go into rigidity or chaos. And when you're in those states of overwhelm, that's when we turn to coping mechanisms. Like I said, we flip it in the interpersonal neurobiology model, and we've got this riverbank of rigidity and riverbank of chaos. And this is in my relational neuroscience class, where we all exist on a spectrum from low to high integration. The only thing that's really important for this class, because we're talking about a dysregulated nervous system, are these concepts of hypoarousal, where you're lethargic, or hyperarousal, where you're manic, and we want to be in the middle, and what is happening to our body when we get on either of those riverbanks, and what we can do about it. So I love this chart. You can just get this chart for $8 on Amazon, and I know you can't see it all, and it's a lot of information. Just pay attention to the colors more than anything else. You want to be in the green and the blue. It's a healthy, functioning nervous system. Your calm states then to a little bit of emotional intensity, Like I'm going to be a little more in that blue zone given this talk because I'm standing up and I'm talking. But then when you have things happen in your life, like a fire alarm went off in this house right now, then I would go into the orange and I would start to go on high alert. And then what happens is over there in the red are kind of more severe responses. And I think that people get into that yellow all the way on the left more once they've been in the extreme red. And I have another slide that will go into this, but the key is just you want to be in the green and the blue. So I want to explain a little bit about the social engagement system, and I'll do the chipmunk piece. So the vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve. A cranial nerve means it's a nerve that attaches directly to the brain. There are 12 of them. You have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, which means they attach directly to the spinal cord. So this one, its name is Wanderer Vagus because it's attached to so many different parts of the body. It goes to your facial muscles, your middle ear, your throat, your bronchi, and I have another slide here. There's two parts of it. I was mentioning that early on. There's a myelinated kind of front part of the body. That's what the ventral vagus nerve means, that only mammals have. And then there's unmyelated dorsal part that reptiles have. So that's more primitive. And it's when we go into that collapse mode. I have a video of a deer freezing that I'll show here for people so you can understand what that is when that part, that dorsal vagus nerve kicks in. And that is that maroon color on that chart that I showed you all over here, all the way on the right. That's the preparing for death, excessive overwhelm. So you just collapse. You go into very slow, and you basically, the mouse will kind of fall, pretend like it's dead so the cat can play with it and its body's limp. You might have heard of that. That's that dorsal vagus nerve response. An interesting thing about this ventral and dorsal vagus nerve is it's just an incredibly adaptive part of being human. It's the reason why a woman can give childbirth but not pass out during it, because her body is able to release all these endogenous opiates to help her not experience the pain of childbirth. So this vagus nerve is really fascinating. I'm not going to be able to explain about all of it. The key is to understand the first action that it's involved in when we first experience stress, and the very last action, which is this collapse. And I have it in the little chipmunk thing. So Charles Darwin first noticed it. He said that it has to do with adaptation. He called it something different back then. What happens is during exhale, the heart rate decreases as the vagus influence increases. So that's why when I was suggesting that diaphragmatic breathing, where you breathe in through the nose and out through the mouth with your lips pursed, where you do a long exhale, that actually will help put you in the parasympathetic state because that long exhale is working with the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve controls and is influenced by respiration. And these first two are the same. This last one is added. When the vagal brake is activated and the parasympathetic nervous system is recruited, heart and respiration rates lower. So the vagal brake is part of the social engagement system. What happens is I hear a loud noise. Let's say I'm giving a talk in the room right now, and there's a loud noise outside. We all look at each other. There doesn't seem to be anything immediate happening. We kind of calm each other down, and I go back to giving the presentation. It's my vagal brake that allows me not to just run outside in a total complete panic and think I'm going to die. It's looking at other people's faces and that what Porges calls a social engagement system that allows for the shifting away from the sympathetic to the parasympathetic in that moment of stress. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about the vagal brake. So like I said, if we slow down our breathing, making it a long exhale, it's a way to put us in the parasympathetic, the rest and digest. And then here's the wonderful chipmunk analogy, which is going to help us. So there's a chipmunk, which is a mammal. And the chipmunk is like, oh no, where's my mommy? I know you can't see some of it because my picture is there. But the chipmunk has lost his mommy and his brother and sisters. And it's like, oh my God, right? And I asked the audience, what do you think is happening next? You can give yourself a minute. What happens to the nervous system of this chipmunk? And a woman in the audience said, sympathetic, fight, flight. But here's the key. There's something that happens milliseconds, not seconds, where you have the opportunity to engage that ventral vagus nerve. And here's how it works for the chipmunk. The chipmunk makes a noise. It's high-pitched, okay? It's undetectable to reptiles, but the chipmunk's mother can hear it. So this is sort of one of the reasons why, like if I'm working with someone, that I try and be careful about my tone, that if you use softer, higher-pitched tones, it's going to soothe the person more, and because it has to do with this vagus nerve. So when the mom finds the baby, she's going to look at him with soft eyes and a warm facial expression, and she may even return his squeak with her own rhythmic squeak. So they're making eye contact and they're soothing each other. This is if the mom hears the squeak. And what happens is the mom takes the chipmunk, where the audience went, aw, back to the safety of the burrow with the chipmunk's brothers and sisters. Okay, so that's like the happy ending. That was the ventral vagus nerve calming the chipmunk down, so it didn't have to go into sympathetic. And then that dorsal vagal collapse, which I'm now going to go into. So let's say that there was no mommy. Then I asked the audience again, what do you think happened next? And this is where the sympathetic is the right answer. So that doesn't happen. So it makes that high squeak sound. Mom doesn't come. So the chipmunk couldn't find the mother, and then a cat approaches. Oh my God, right? Then it's really going into the sympathetic state. So then what does the chipmunk do? It runs, right? Or it gets ready to bite the cat. So that's the brain would shut off the ventral vagal system and activate the sympathetic nervous system. So it could run and hide, or if a cat could bite the cat. That's step two. So this is a three-part part of the polyvagal theory. So if the fight or flight doesn't work, so this is step 3, the chipmunk's dorsal vagus nerve kicks into gear and it freezes. It slows down its respiration and heart rate, and it lets off those endogenous opiates to kill pain. So this is the same mechanism that allows a woman to give birth. It's happening here. Here's kind of the chipmunk preparing to die. And this is that collapse, that faint. So in the wild, the next best thing that an animal can do is pretend like it's dead, because if that predator thinks that the animal is dead, he may not eat it because he thinks it's unsanitary. Also, like a cat playing with a mouse and like playing with it in its mouth and just wiggling it around. If the body's limp, it's less likely to get injured. So there are reasons why we do this collapse. But a lot of people, when this has happened to them, when they're extremely overwhelmed in their life and they collapsed and then they woke up again, they tend to think that their nervous system failed them. And my main message when I'm talking about how to regulate the nervous system and trauma is that your nervous system never failed you. Your nervous system is highly adaptive and intelligent. And it did what it needed to do, especially in moments of overwhelm. And what we need to do is we need to honor the body and appreciate the body and understand the language that it's speaking when you get signs and signals and when you behave in ways not proper to the context of the stimuli you receive. So again, what we want to do is we want to step away from judging how our body responds. Like, for example, to that loud fire alarm or that loud noise outside, we don't want to judge that. We know that our response to those noises are dependent on what has happened to us in the past. And if we have bad memories from the past, we can do, I'm going to talk about it, this memory reconciliation to help heal those. So we can move forward in time and have a wider window of tolerance, choose new behavioral responses based on the stimuli we're receiving in present time. So when an animal does this, it's called tonic immobility. That's a technical term. And the running chipmunk was that orange over here, that fight flight. And then when it gets to hyper freeze, it slams on the brakes and then it goes to this preparing for death. And you'll see the dorsal vagus nerve there on the screen. So this chipmunk here is that maroon on the chart. And this is just polyvagal, how it works. So if you see this chart here, first you have sleep and boredom, which is that hypoarousal. Then the ventral vagus circuit, the brake comes on, engaged at rest and socially engaged. So Porges says that the hallmark of health, not only for a couple, but for a society, is to be able to be in immobilization and to be happy, like to be safely in a state of immobilization. So you're in the freeze that chipmunk is in, but you're actually able to enjoy it, right? Which actually is arousal, if you think about it in sexual play. You don't have to be on guard, but you can relax and you're in a trusting environment. So what happens is you have a higher level of emotional intensity, but you calm it down because of your vagus nerve. Then what happens is you realize there really is, this is the yellow area, a threat, an immediate threat. That's when your sympathetic nervous system comes online, you fight, flight, you decide what to do, and then at the very end, if you actually know that you're about to die or your brain tells you you're about to die, then you'll have that shut down. And this is just a model of those 3 parts of the nervous system that I was talking about: the parasympathetic, the sympathetic, and then the social engagement system. And the idea is that there's a hierarchy. We play our newest, best card first. And if that doesn't work, we try our older second card. So the first card is that ventral vagal nerve where we're looking around like the chipmunk looking for his mom. And like a baby will let out a cry. So that's the first attempt. The second attempt is just you're freaking out, you're in that orange sympathetic zone, and then you just collapse if you don't get what you want and what you need at that time of survival. So this just gets more into it. That's a really complex slide. The goal is not just to explain all this in great detail, it's just to understand that in addition to the sympathetic and the parasympathetic and this idea of primitive urges and the pleasure trap, that you have the vagus nerve, you have the social engagement system. So what you can use is you can use your environment to help calm yourself down. And that's like a component that's become more understood in the last 20 years, which relational neuroscience, talking about the relational nature of the brain, that's my main message. Like if you think of a snapshot of a picture of someone you love, let's say you're a guy and you have your girlfriend, this is my wife, this is my girlfriend. So in the same way, like in terms of people talk about self-regulation, calming yourself down, self-soothing, like that's like the hallmark of good health. The truth is that we learn to self-regulate and self-soothe because we have a snapshot in our pocket of co-regulating successfully when we were very young. So I think that there's an overemphasis on self-regulation, but some people, if they never really got proper co-regulation when they were young, they don't have their brain wired up in a way that it needs to. But here is the kicker, based on what we know about neuroplasticity, is that because you have a vagus nerve and you're part of the human race, you have within you, evolutionarily, the capacity to have a healthy social engagement system, even if you did not get that growing up. What you can do is you can find an adult and get what's called an earned secure attachment with them, and they can say, you know, what happened to you was a crime. They can let you know that even though your social system when you were young, it didn't point out the things that were going on that was wrong, that you can go back and you can make right what was wrong with the support of a community around you. And you can heal those memories. And you're thinking complex thought. You're using the higher functions of the brain, all those 9 functions of the prefrontal cortex, like insight, empathy. It requires all these higher functions to go back in and reprogram those memories. So I prefer the word extreme overwhelm rather than the word trauma. I think all of us experience moments of extreme overwhelm, and there are some people who've had terrible trauma. And wherever you are in your life, I want people to know that if you can find someone, you can at least allow the possibility to trust, because it is important that you trust someone so that you can go brain to brain and you can sync up with the social engagement system, that you can actually kind of rewire the brain and help heal it. So this is from Peter Levine. It's called Somatic Experiencing. It's his book, In an Unspoken Voice. He talks about how fear and immobility, or fear and rage, are trapped in an undifferentiated pod. In my interpersonal neurobiology, I talk about how the hallmark of health is integration, and the definition of integration is high differentiation plus high linkage. It's being able to link differentiated systems. So when you have this completely undifferentiated fear and immobility or fear and rage, this is the problem. And when we alternate between different nervous system states, which I'm going to explain in the next slide with the memory reconsolidation, when you go between different nervous system states and someone helps to co-regulate you and you're self-regulating yourself with these different resources, that's how the nervous system is reset and healed. So I'm just going to go through this real quick. This is kind of the healthy, the green and the blue, stimulated, motivated, challenged, engaged, the healthy nervous system, where you have wide windows of tolerance. This is the sympathetic, where you have an increased heart rate. These are the types of things that happen. You have your blood flow going to the arms and the legs, your heart speeds up, your digestion slows. You have that release of cortisol, like I mentioned earlier. Then you get to the freeze. What happens is, this is like, first you get into the freeze, and then you go into collapse. And here was an incredible video of a deer when that happened. This is a police officer. First he's tapping the deer. And he's not understanding why it's not moving. So what happened was, before this video was made, a car almost hit the deer but didn't. So he's in this freeze and actually this collapse state. And so the cop actually has to move the deer, otherwise it's going to hit by a car. So he picks it up. You can see how heavy it is. And it says that that deer was in that for 25 seconds like that. What he eventually does is kind of tap it, and then it wakes up. So that's just an example of something in the wild that happens, and it can happen with us. This is the last really complex slide I'll put on. So this is what happens when we get into these, the yellow and the red and the maroon from that chart. When our nervous system gets severely dysregulated and things get in that trauma pod, it's this purple, these purple parts. So what happens is a part of us goes on with normal life. Better not to know too much. That's the conscious part. Then there's another part, these traumatized parts, that they get locked down, and sometimes we're not aware of them. And there are these 5 categories. And just one example here, if you look at submit, collapse, go numb, where there's kind of this good girl self-sacrificing. If a child is in an environment where they really are being abused, and they speak up and they speak up and they speak up and they speak up and nothing is ever done, eventually the child will go into this submit, collapse, go numb. It really is because the child must choose to sacrifice itself in order to safely bond with the caregiver. Again, it's a normal mechanism, a bonding mechanism the child does to survive. But what happens is that part of him or herself that she represses, it can be locked in time, and part of it can become over here very judgmental. If you look at this fight, self-protection one, and what I've seen when people who have that collapse, go numb, loss of repeated trauma from childhood, is that they tend to be very judgmental. They tend to need to be in control. And I mention this because the person, it's good to remember, if they're very judgmental, that it's the fight response wanting to complete itself. And if you find yourself, that's again in the limbic brain where you're black-white thinking and you're judging, you could just think there may be a part of me that just needs to complete that stress response. And if I were to somehow find a way to complete it, my tendency to be judgmental may decrease. So there can be an edge to us being judgmental, which have to do with these trapped trauma parts. And I can't say enough without clear examples, but I've definitely seen it be true in specific case examples. So this going on with normal life is the green and the blue. And then this is just kind of a rough estimate of these other states of the, like, where you're lethargic, or you go into freeze, or you get stressed out. So these are just different states of the nervous system. And I talk about all 5 of these are part of the SQUID, or the anti-self system, and Firestone's separation theory. So I have a talk I'm going to talk about at the end, which explains SQUID. And it's just a way to understand when people are really highly defended, when they do stonewalling, when they do contempt, when they blame other people, when they have to when they can't be aware in real time and intimate, when they need to use their phone, when they need to gamble, when they need to use detached, compulsive, masturbatory sex as a way to reduce intimacy, that it's these mechanisms inside substituting real in-person love food, which is a healthy functioning social engagement system. It's these mechanisms that developed when they were young in the brain. It can also relate to genetics, but it's just a mismatch. It's a miswiring of the brain. And I call it the squid, and I'll do a better job explaining it at the end with one slide. But I have another presentation that explains that. And for me, it's giving much more compassion with difficult people, that that is what's going on. And what I would say in this interpersonal neurobiology framework is that from low integration to high integration, that someone with a really strong squid, which is like an inner critical voice, and that fantasy bond, that they're in a lower state of integration. Their brain isn't integrated up. Like the corpus callosum between the left and the right hemispheres, it can be small, and then you're not able to regulate your affect, your emotions. So you get really strong emotions, and you get overwhelmed really easily, and you can't communicate what you want to communicate, and you can't stay present and caring, but you just behave inappropriately and you isolate yourself. So it can be a lack of integration that can lead to these poor behaviors and an excessive differentiating from society and isolation. So finally, I'm going to end on memory reconciliation. I know I keep saying that word. Memory consolidation is a science term for when a short-term memory gets put in the long-term memory. And then memory reconsolidation is when a long-term memory is changed. And that's done by a mismatch experience. A mismatch experience is when you put a new meaning onto something that doesn't lock up with the old meaning. So you superimpose new meaning, and you want to do this very creatively. Those parts that I mentioned earlier, those 5 parts at the bottom, we'll just call it the emotional brain, where implicit memory is, where that trauma pod lies. It pays attention to imagery, to metaphor. There's certain language that it can hear better rather than logic. So there's a way of, it's like dream interpretation. There's a way to communicate with that part of us to help create this mismatch experience. And there are different modalities, EMDR, somatic experiencing, which create this mismatch experience. But the number one predictor, I will say this, of successful outcome in therapy is the quality of the therapeutic alliance. What is that? How much you trust your therapist, because that's going to be the social engagement system calming down, so you have access to the regulatory features of the vagus nerve. If you don't feel safe, then your whole nervous system isn't going to come online such that you're going to give yourself the opportunity to rewire it. So you got to feel safe with the person you're working with. And this book by Courtney Armstrong, it just came out like a week ago, Rethinking Trauma Treatment. That's what these quotes were from. I have worksheets on the memory reconsolidation. I know I didn't go into it in great detail. The way I do it is you have, I call it your superhero team, so you feel really supported. And then we all go together and we kind of crack open the door of a memory, and we let that in as much as we want to let it in. And then we can do different things with it, and we can wave a magic wand and we can make it right. There's just different things we can do so that when you think back on that memory, you have a mismatch experience, and then there's not as much charge to it, and you'll find your window of tolerance widens. Because the way the brain works, and I talk about this in my caregiver stress book, Neuroscience, Neurobiology of the Rescue, the way the brain works is, let's say you're just not really cool with anger, so whenever anyone's angry or whenever you're angry, you just shut it down. Well, the brain doesn't work like that. If you shut down your tolerance for anger, you actually shut down your tolerance for all emotions. So it's the same on the other side. If you just work with this one memory, the way the brain works is you widen your window of tolerance for whatever specific issue you worked with that memory. It actually helps to heal a lot of things. And you widen your overall window of tolerance for that emotional intensity or that arousal. Your overall window of tolerance gets wider. So just by working on one thing, you actually heal the whole thing. And I talked about the squid, and if those below parts can complete the stress response cycle, the repressed feelings come back into everyday conscious awareness. So that's the idea. And I'll talk about this when I do my squid talk, which is Firestone's defense mechanisms. But in his theory, there's the self system and the anti-self system. The self system is like your prefrontal cortex, where you can think about thinking, the pilot of your life. And then this squid are these kind of unconscious parts of yourself. And these two form what's called a psychological equilibrium. That's the most fascinating thing about the whole theory. It's what made me fall in love with the theory. The idea is if you do things to improve your life situation, the squid will pull you down because you get increased anxiety states because the psychological equilibrium gets disturbed. So that's beyond what I can talk about here. The key is that your nervous system is always regulating itself, is always acting intelligently, and all we have to do is figure out how to work with it, how to understand the language of it, and we can release ourselves. We can differentiate from the things that we don't want, and we can link up to the things we do want. So that's that talk about the prefrontal cortex and the squid, which is your defense mechanisms. And you can do a consult with me if you're interested. What I was going to say about all this, about coming to know our nervous system, is that once we befriend it, the definition of integration is high differentiation, high linkage. And so when we think about our small intestines, they have these microvilli that absorb all the nutrients. And a healthy small intestine is able to absorb the nutrients and then poo out the rest, get rid of the rest. And so a good functioning mind is the same way. It takes in all the information, both from the outside world and from your body, and it keeps what's good and nourishing, and it lets go of what is no longer nourishing and good. And with this memory reconsolidation, with understanding a dysregulated nervous system, you can actually have the tools to think about thinking, to have goal-directed behavior, and to choose, not get stuck in your pleasure trap, but to choose and to create the life you want. So thank you for taking the time to listen to this class. If you have any questions, reach out to me. I will help however I can.